is there too much American government debt? So much so that the feds themselves have to step in to support the Treasury market, lest the value disintegrate. That's a question that Jeff Snider, head of global research, answered in a recent post at Alhambra Investments, and it's called Quarrel with Quarles. Over too little, not too many. It was posted on October 27th. And Jeff, you start off the article by introducing us to Subsidiary CCC. And I don't know if it's just this time of year, us being so close to All Hallows Eve, but just that name, it sounds sinister, it sounds suspicious, it sounds spooky, conspiratorial, like one of those corporations you learn about in a documentary. Perhaps a documentary not unlike the 2004 American film Resident Evil, about the rise of the undead, starring Mila Jovovich and Sienna Gilroy and Michelle Rodriguez. And of course, there was also Ali Larder. There were some dudes in it too, Jeff, but that doesn't matter. The point is, Jeff, is this article about the rise of the undead?
I think it's about the rise of the undead and the undeadness of the undead, right? I mean, why can't you kill this thing? And it's, CCC is menacing, not just, in the way that you're talking about, but see, the joke is CCC is triple C's or triple hooks, which is, junk bonds. And CCC was a subsidiary of a company called Carlyle, which was a financial firm that most people should be aware of, but of course they're not, because they think that 2008, the first global financial crisis, was about subprime mortgages. Now, CCC, Carlyle, a subsidiary of Carlyle, was invested in highly rated mortgage securities, and they were highly rated mortgage securities, and by and large, they weren't subprime toxic waste. Yet, this Carlyle subsidiary failed, was insolvent, illiquid, a couple of weeks before Bear Stearns fails. And in many ways, Carlyle precipitated the events that led to Bear Stearns' demise, which was really a demise. Getting sold with the Fed's aid into J.P. Morgan's hands isn't really the rescue that authorities want you to believe it was. So Carlyle was one of those backstory parts of the system going wrong, and how it was going wrong and why it was going wrong, that explained a lot about what followed, which wasn't recovery, which wasn't a flood of liquidity, which wasn't successful monetary policies, quite the opposite. Because when you look at highly rated mortgage securities and a firm that only invested in those, and were using them in the repo market as collateral, and when the repo market started to reject not subprime, but prime and highly rated prime securities, that was a signal that it wasn't a subprime problem or a Carlyle problem. It was a systemic repo problem, therefore systemic dollar problem.
So that subsidiary failed in March 2008, or Carlyle failed in 2008? I think it was just the subsidiary. Is that right? And it's sort of interesting that I guess they weren't big enough to be bailed out or sold off by the federal government.
Yeah, and it was a smaller fund, and of course, it's strange that they weren't, because it was highly connected. Not just one of the executives at Carlyle was a guy named Randal Quarles, who had been undersecretary in the Treasury Secretary, or the Treasury Department, undersecretary for, I believe, domestic banking. So, I mean, this is a guy who was connected in the Bush administration, left there after saying everything was great in 2006. The whole world's awesome, banking system's wonderful, we've done a great job. Jumps ship to Carlyle, I believe in early 2007. And then, of course, Carlyle plays a key role in at least identifying for people paying attention what was really wrong during the first global financial crisis. And then, of course, Quarles makes a reappearance in 2017 when, of course, he's failed upward like the rest of them, appointed and nominated and approved for a spot on the Federal Reserve Board.
That's right. And so, yes, he was in 2006 the Undersecretary for Domestic Well, it
was a domestic
finance.
Crisis.
Exactly. There you go.
Same thing at that time,
That's
right?
right?
Finance crisis. It was all the same.
But he didn't say it. That's the point. And I guess because he was in a political position, so he had to always provide, that's what politicians do, not leaders. But okay, so fine, that was 2006. He didn't see the biggest crisis of 80 years coming. Okay. Then, a few years later, he becomes, let's call it a decade, vice chair of the Federal Reserve for supervision. And the reason we're bringing all this up is because a reader, a listener, a watcher recommended that we talk about Randal Quarles' speech. And we did. But guess what, Jeff? You talked about the part that you thought was important, but that's not what the financial media was focused on. Which part were they focused on, and what did you talk about?
Well, it's actually the part that was important because the financial media missed how it played the role in what everything else, or what everybody else is talking about. What Quarles said basically was, look, the banking system is fixed. Now, he took credit for it when we all know the banking system fixed itself starting in August of 2007. And that's the reason why Carlyle failed and Bear Stearns failed and Lehman Brothers failed, because banks started stopping doing the insane proliferation of products that they had been doing up to that point and began to clean up their balance sheets because, by and large, they realized the Federal Reserve was useless. Therefore, they're out there on their own, and if they want to engage in stupid stuff, they're going to end up like Bear Stearns or Carlyle or Lehman. And so banks began to clean up their own balance sheets, undertake less risky behaviors, which in the current context means that we're not going to expect another Lehman Brothers because banks don't operate like Lehman Brothers used to operate. But that's actually a problem because the system, the dollar system, the global dollar system, that proliferation of products requires banks to act in very risky behavior. So it's either one or the other. If you want the dollar system to grow and the economy to globalize and grow with it, you need banks taking on risks. If you want safe banks that are never going to fail, then you're not going to have dollar system growth, and then you're not going to have economic growth and globalization. Or the only other option is to redo the entire system. Those are the only options that we really have. And what's happened over the last dozen years is banks have shrunk. They've improved their balance sheets, and the Federal Reserve says that's a measure of success. And that's what Quarles was saying. However, there was this big problem in March. Okay, the banking system was great, performed awesome. So maybe the Fed did its job, but yet everything else was screwed up. Markets went into fire sale liquidations all over the world. So did the Fed do a good job? Well, if we think about the Federal Reserve as a central bank, then no, it couldn't have. But the Federal Reserve is not a central bank. The Federal Reserve is a domestic bank regulator, which, by the way, is Quarles' specific purview. And what he said was, yes, the financial system was a total mess, but it ain't our job.
Yeah, his part of the system didn't fail. The banks did okay. And so the speech that everyone is talking about is the one of a few weeks ago. But you brought up the 2006 speech where he said, everything's fine. And you also brought up the 2018 speech where he said, quote, I am fairly optimistic about the current state of the economy along many dimensions. It has been quite some time since the economic environment has looked so favorable as it does now. But Jeff, in late 27, early 2018, what was happening in Japan? What did the Wall Street Journal think was happening?
Yeah, 2017 and really early 2018, we started to see signs that no, Mr. Quarles, things were not favorable. In fact, they had been turned highly unfavorable already. Especially in January 2018, you started to see the euro. You started to see Japanese banks selling their treasuries again, as well as other foreigners. And again, that's common misconception, is going back to a long ways, that the U.S. government can never sell enough of its debt without foreign investors. If foreign investors ever start selling, oh boy, the federal government's in big, big trouble. The treasury market's going to collapse and crash. Except that wasn't the case. Of course, remember, December 2017, the Trump administration passed tax reform, which expanded the deficit greatly. So in early 2018, you had Japanese selling their treasuries. At the same time, the Treasury was selling a lot more treasuries, and it was supposed to lead to this epic disaster. And a dollar crash, treasury crash, all these things, even though that was supposed to be good for globally synchronized growth. But yet, when you look at what's happened since 2014 in particular, foreigners have been buying a lot less treasuries, and in some cases outright selling them. Yet when they're doing that, by and large, the treasury market is rallying. Interest rates are falling, not rising. And the reason is because of all the stuff that Randal Quarles and the Federal Reserve never pay any attention to, which is the global dollar system. When there aren't enough dollars in that dollar system, Foreigners have to sell their reserves, which are largely locked up in treasuries, in order to try to offset the dollar supply their local banks can't get from the Eurodollar market. So foreign selling of treasuries is not a negative for treasuries. It's a positive. It's a signal because it says, hey, there's a dollar problem going on, which tells you there'll be increased demand for treasuries, regardless of the supply of them.
Which brings us to the most recent speech by Quarles. And the part that everyone focused on was the intimation that the Fed, the government, would have to step in to help support the market because, as he put it, foreign and official private investors were selling treasuries. And he noted that the intense and widespread selling pressures appear to have overwhelmed dealers' capacity or willingness to absorb and intermediate treasury securities. Thus, therefore, the Fed or the government needs to step in. But then, Jeff, you ask, well, how come no one ever asks why this dealer capacity was overwhelmed or the desire disappeared?
Yeah, why, Randy? Why were everybody selling treasuries? I mean, he's acting as if this is a separate and distinct issue. There's the banking system and there's treasury market, and the two don't ever meet. You know, they're not connected in any way. And so what he's saying is, and we go back to, remember March, not only were stocks selling off, but for a while there, the long end of the treasury curve in particular was rates were rising rapidly as liquidations hit the treasury market too. And we've talked about that before, the bifurcation between on the run and off the run. But to a guy like, Federal Reserve guy like Randy Quarles, what he's saying is that that's not our job either. We have to step in and clean up the mess in the treasury market, which it's not even the cart before the horse, as I wrote. He doesn't even know which is the cart and what's the horse. Why were everybody selling foreigners in particular? Why were they selling treasuries? It wasn't that the treasury market got too big. It's the dollar shortage got too big. The liquidity got so low, intermediation stopped. Dealers were shy, as you pointed out, Emil. All of this stuff is related, and that's why the selling of treasuries happened. So what the Federal Reserve should have done, if it wasn't actually a central bank, is not look at this like, oh, we need to clean up the mess in the treasury market. It's to say, oh my God, we did such a bad job in the global dollar system. We should have fixed that. Then there wouldn't have been any mess in the treasury market to begin with. They've got it all wrong because they look at this from the perspective of a domestic bank regulator, not as a global dollar central bank, which is what's really lacking here. So it's the dollar shortage that got so bad that not only were foreigners forced to sell their treasuries, dealers said, we're not even intermediating, especially on the off-the-run securities, which we're not sure are going to have a market. And so it became a self-reinforcing thing. The dollar shortage made dealers act shy. That shyness meant the dollar shortage got bigger, which led to more selling in treasuries and other markets, which meant dealers got even shyer. And there was no one there to step in and break that cycle, which is the role of a central bank. So these guys not only did they not perform the role of a central bank, they don't even know what the hell the role of a central bank actually is or what they should be doing. They're looking at it from the end result and saying, well, it must be too many treasuries because the treasury market was a mess. No, genius. There weren't enough dollars, and that's why everything was a mess.
And then did the mess kind of fix itself? Because that's a question that sometimes comes up is how did the system correct itself? Is it because the system found the dollars in March, or that the worst of the funnel, the constriction passed? What was it?
I think it was some of both, because what you end up happening was you find a new equilibrium. You find a lower level or lower state. Think about it in physics where things reduce to a lower energy state. They find a new equilibrium. So after a massive amount of dollar destruction, leverage destruction, economic destruction, all of these things happen. I mean, just tremendously unnecessary destruction up and down the board. And in addition to that, you had the March bottleneck going by. And so, things started to go right again. Dealers started to step in because there were values, there was prices at lower levels. There's opportunities to come back into the market. And that's why, for one, you saw treasuries, the prices and especially the long end rallied sharply. So they went down in the initial crisis, then yields went down, then they went way up, and then they went way down again because the worst had passed and everybody wanted to get back into the treasury market again.
Scary stuff, Jeff. I asked you earlier if there are any horror movies that you enjoy. You said not particularly, but I'm guessing then you don't have any favorite horror stories. Is that right? Or horror
I think
poetry?
we're telling them.
That's right.
We might have to change the name of this episode to, monetary horror tales. Something like the Twilight Zone, Twilight Money Zone.
Monetary horror tales. I like that title. We'll go with it. Well, my favorite poem happens to be Darkness by Lord Byron. It's about the end of the world. It's a beautiful poem, people. It's not my fault. I like it, okay? I don't know why people call me Dr. Doom. It's a beautiful poem, all right? Forgive me. And I also like Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. But there's one that I really enjoy as well called Nauseous Nocturne. And it's by Bill Watterson. And I'm going to read 2 stanzas from it. I kind of adjusted it for our audience. Okay, so here, bear with me. Another night deprived of slumber, hours passing without number. My eyes trace around the room. I lay dripping sweat, now quite certain that tonight the final curtain drops upon my short life's precious play. From the darkness by the chair comes a noise, much like a printer, a maddening burr, burr, burr sound. It seems some ill-intentioned economist, anticipating I'll invest, is spooling bank reserves on the ground. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you. I'm going to keep my day job, but, that's not the worst thing I've ever done.
That is one scary tale if you think about it.